The rain had fallen in sheets for 3 days straight, transforming the sleepy town of Willow Creek into a sodden labyrinth of swollen streams and muddy hollows. The air was thick with the scent of wet earth and pine, and the sky hung low, a bruised canopy of gray that seemed to press down on the world below. In the midst of this deluge, Caleb Morrow, a wiry man of 32 with a penchant for solitude, stood at the edge of his property, staring into the churning waters of the creek that had once been a tame trickle. His boots sank into the mire, and his breath fogged in the chilly air as he scanned the banks, his sharp green eyes catching on something unnatural, a flash of tawny fur thrashing against the current. It was a bobcat, its sleek form half submerged, claws scrabbling at a slick outcrop of rock. The creature's eyes, wide with panic, glowed like twin lanterns in the dim light. Caleb's heart thudded, not out of fear but from a strange, primal urge to act. He'd seen bobcats before, slinking through the woods like ghosts, but this one was no phantom. It was drowning, and it was fighting with every ounce of its wild spirit to survive. Without a second thought, Caleb shed his raincoat, letting it fall into the mud, and waded into the icy water. The current tugged at his legs, a cold, relentless hand, but he pressed forward, his focus locked on the struggling animal. The bobcat's snarls were swallowed by the roar of the water as Caleb reached it. He extended a calloused hand, expecting a slash of claws, but the creature was too exhausted to fight. Wrapping his arms around its sodden frame, he hauled it against his chest, feeling its heartbeat hammering against his own. The weight of the animal was surprising, its muscled body heavier than it looked, but Caleb was strong from years of splitting wood and hauling supplies up the mountain. With a grunt, he staggered back to the bank, the bobcat limp in his arms, its breath ragged but alive. He set it down on a patch of grass, expecting it to bolt, but it didn't. The bobcat lay there, shivering, its amber eyes fixed on him with an intensity that sent a shiver down his spine. Not of fear, but of something deeper, something he couldn't name. Caleb knelt beside it, his hands hovering, unsure whether to touch it again. The rain plastered his dark hair to his forehead, and his flannel shirt clung to his skin, but he barely noticed. The world had narrowed to this moment, this creature, this strange communion between man and beast. As he watched, the bobcat's breathing steadied, and it struggled to its feet, shaking water from its fur in a spray that caught the faint light. Then, with a low growl, it turned and vanished into the underbrush, leaving Caleb alone with the sound of the rain and the pounding of his own pulse. He stood, wiping his hands on his jeans, and trudged back to his cabin, unaware that his neighbors, hidden behind curtains and cracked blinds, had been watching from their windows, their whispers already weaving a story that would soon ripple through Willow Creek like the creek itself. By morning, the rain had eased to a drizzle, but the town was buzzing. Caleb, who kept to himself and rarely ventured beyond the general store, was now the subject of fervent speculation. Old Mrs. Hargrove, whose porch overlooked the creek, swore she'd seen him wrestle the bobcat from the water like some modern-day Hercules. Tom Blevins, the mechanic, claimed the animal wasn't a bobcat at all but something larger, something unnatural, though he couldn't say what. The rumors grew wilder with each retelling. Caleb had tamed a mountain lion, some said. Others whispered he'd made a pact with the forest itself, trading favors with spirits older than the town. Caleb, oblivious to the chatter, went about his day. He chopped wood, repaired a leak in his roof, and sipped black coffee from a chipped mug, his thoughts drifting back to the bobcat. He couldn't shake the memory of its eyes, the way they'd held his, as if it had seen something in him he didn't know was there. That evening, as the sun dipped below the ridge, painting the sky in hues of fire and ash, he heard a sound outside, a low, guttural yowl that made the hairs on his neck stand on end. He stepped onto his porch, the boards creaking under his weight, and there it was, the bobcat, sitting at the edge of his yard, its silhouette sharp against the fading light. It didn't run. It didn't growl. It just watched him, its tail flicking lazily, as if it had come to collect on a debt. Caleb's breath caught in his throat. He'd saved its life, but now it was here on his land, and he felt the weight of its presence like a stone in his chest. He took a step forward, and the bobcat mirrored him, moving closer, its movements fluid and deliberate. Then, from the shadows of the trees, another shape emerged. A second bobcat, smaller, its fur matted and one ear torn. Then another, and another, for pairs of eyes gleamed in the dusk, all fixed on Caleb, who stood frozen, his heart racing as he realized he was no longer just a man who'd saved a wild thing. He was something else entirely, though what that was, he couldn't yet fathom. The townsfolk, peering from their safe, dry homes, saw only the beginning of this strange tableau. They saw Caleb standing on his porch, surrounded by shadows that moved like predators, and they felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. What they didn't see, what they couldn't see, was the moment Caleb took another step toward the bobcats, his fear giving way to a reckless curiosity, a pull towards something wild and untamed within himself. And as he did, the largest bobcat, the one he'd saved, let out a sound that was not a growl or a snarl but something softer, almost a call, and the others echoed it, a chorus that seemed to rise from the earth itself. In that moment, Caleb Morrow ceased to be just a man of Willow Creek. He was a bridge, a conduit, a keeper of secrets he didn't yet understand. And as the night closed in, the bobcats melted back into the forest, leaving him alone but changed, with the eyes of the town upon him and the weight of their whispers growing heavier by the hour. The days that followed were a blur of whispers and sidelong glances in Willow Creek. Caleb Morrow, once a shadow who slipped through the town unnoticed, had become its reluctant enigma. The general store buzzed with theories. Some said he'd been chosen by the forest, others that he was cursed, his act of saving the bobcat a bargain with forces no one dared name. Children spun tales of a man who could speak to beasts, while their parents traded hushed warnings about the dangers of meddling with the wild. Caleb felt the weight of their stares as he hauled firewood or fetched supplies, but he said nothing, his jaw set, his green eyes distant. He didn't care for their stories. He cared only for the bobcats, which returned each night, silent sentinels at the edge of his property, their eyes like lanterns in the dark. By the fifth night, Caleb had stopped questioning their presence. He'd taken to leaving scraps of venison from his hunts near the tree line, watching from his porch as the largest bobcat, the one he'd pulled from the creek, approached first, its movements deliberate, almost ceremonial. The others followed, their forms weaving through the shadows, and Caleb felt a strange peace settle over him, as if he were part of something ancient, something bigger than himself. But peace was a fragile thing in Willow Creek, and the town's curiosity was turning to unease. It began with Tom Blevins, the mechanic, whose pickup truck roared up Caleb's muddy drive one gray morning. Tom was a burly man with a temper as quick as his wrench, and he'd been drinking, his breath sour with whiskey as he pounded on Caleb's door. "What are you playin' at, Morrow?" he bellowed, his voice carrying over the drizzle. "You think you can bring those things into our town? They're predators, damn it." Caleb stood in the doorway, his frame lean but unyielding, and said nothing. Tom's accusations grew wilder. He claimed the bobcats had been seen near his garage, that they'd spooked his dogs, that they were a threat. Caleb's silence only fueled his anger, and Tom left with a parting threat. "You keep those beasts away, or I'll take care of 'em myself." That night, the bobcats didn't come. Caleb waited until the moon hung high, its light fractured by the clouds, But the tree line remained empty. A knot of unease tightened in his chest. He pulled on his boots and grabbed a flashlight, its beam cutting through the mist as he ventured into the woods. The air was heavy, the ground soft underfoot, and every snap of a twig set his nerves on edge. He followed the faint trail the bobcats had worn into the earth, his breath shallow, until he reached a clearing where the creek widened into a pool. There, under the pale glow of the moon, he saw them. Not just the 4 he'd seen before, but a dozen, maybe more, their eyes reflecting like scattered stars. At their center was the largest bobcat, its fur gleaming, its gaze fixed on Caleb as if it had been waiting. But something was wrong. The smallest bobcat, the one with the torn ear, lay on its side, its breathing shallow. Caleb's flashlight caught the glint of metal. A crude trap, its jaws clamped around the creature's leg. Rage surged through him, hot and sharp. He knelt beside the bobcat, his hands steady despite the tremor in his chest, and worked the trap open, wincing as the animal let out a weak hiss. The others watched, their bodies tense, but they didn't move. Caleb lifted the injured bobcat, its weight light in his arms, and carried it back to his cabin, the others trailing behind like a silent procession. He tended to the creature's wound with supplies from his first aid kit, his hands gentle but sure. The bobcat didn't struggle, its eyes locked on his, and Caleb felt that same pull he'd felt the first night. A connection that went beyond reason, beyond the boundaries of man and beast. By dawn, the bobcat was resting, its breathing steady, and Caleb stepped outside to find the others gone, save for the largest, which lingered at the edge of his yard. It met his gaze, then turned and vanished into the trees, leaving behind a single paw print in the mud, deep and deliberate, like a signature. The town, however, was not so easily appeased. Word of the bobcats' growing numbers spread, and with it came fear. Mrs. Hargrove claimed she'd seen them prowling her garden. The schoolteacher reported tracks near the playground. Tom Blevins, emboldened by the town's unrest, rallied a group of men, their faces grim as they gathered at the general store with rifles and traps. "We can't let Morrow turn this place into a zoo," Tom declared, his voice carrying the weight of a man who believed he was protecting his own. They planned to march to Caleb's cabin, to demand he drive the bobcats away or face consequences. Caleb knew none of this as he sat by the injured bobcat, watching its chest rise and fall. But he felt the shift in the air, the way the wind carried a restless edge. That evening, as the sun bled red across the horizon, he heard the rumble of engines and the crunch of boots on gravel. He stepped onto his porch, his shotgun resting against the wall, not yet in his hands but close enough. Tom led the group, his face flushed, his rifle slung over his shoulder. "This ends tonight, Morrow," he called. "You're bringin' trouble to us all." Caleb's voice was low, steady. "I didn't bring him. They came to me." The men shifted uneasily, their eyes darting to the shadows, where the bobcats had begun to emerge, one by one, their forms silent and deliberate. The largest stood closest to Caleb, its body low, its eyes unblinking. The men froze, their bravado faltering as the reality of what they faced sank in. These were not pets, not strays, they were wild and they were unafraid. What happened next shocked Willow Creek to its core. The largest bobcat stepped forward, its growl a low rumble that seemed to vibrate through the earth. The others followed, forming a loose circle around Caleb's cabin, their eyes glinting in the fading light. Tom raised his rifle, but before he could act, Caleb stepped in front of the bobcat, his hands empty but his stance unyielding. You shoot through me," he said, his voice carrying a weight that silenced the men. For a long moment no one moved. The air crackled with tension, the bobcat's growls mingling with the wind. Then, from the woods came a sound, a low, resonant yowl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. The bobcats froze, their ears twitching, and even Tom lowered his rifle, his face pale. The sound grew, a chorus of unseen voices, and the men backed away, their courage crumbling. They fled, their trucks roaring into the night, leaving Caleb and the bobcats alone under the stars. In the weeks that followed, the bobcats vanished as quietly as they'd come. The injured one healed and slipped into the forest, leaving only a faint scar on Caleb's porch where its blood had stained the wood. The town never spoke of that night, but the whispers about Caleb changed. He was no longer just the man who'd saved a bobcat. He was the man who'd stood with them, who'd faced down fear and won. And Caleb, now truly alone, felt the forest's pulse in his veins, a secret he'd carry forever, a bond forged in water and blood, unbreakable and wild.